So welcome, mariners. Mariners? Are you a mariner? I don't know whether you'd give it any thought, but here's what our president thinks. Connected by the waters, we're all mariners. That was Howard Hagee's statement. Well, if we're all mariners, there's a museum in England that's kind of a mariners museum. It's called the National Maritime Museum. And it's there because England owes their current position to their past positions as the ruler of the seas. Everything that built England's strength was built on the waters. Now, that kind of applies to us too, doesn't it? America, we had the Mayflower and the Speedwell. We had the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, the Discovery. We had the Santa Maria and the Santa Clara, which we know as Nina, and the Pinta, who came in 1492. And long before that, about 500 years before that, we had a fellow named Leifer in the upper part. So shouldn't we have a maritime museum? I've been arguing for this, and I want to remind you, I think it should be at the Mariners Museum. Yeah, maybe I'm a little prejudiced. So I tried entering that. Why can't we have a maritime museum that is national at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia? I was turned down. Why? We already had one, and it's right here. And this is not something we named ourselves. Congress named us America's National Maritime Museum some years ago. We're very proud of that. The Mariners Museum opened to the public in 1933. Late 30s, this is what the main hall looked like. This is, I'm going to say this is about 36 or 37, the main exhibit room of Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, and it stayed this way. Yeah, we changed the carpet, put a little paint here and there, but it stayed pretty much this way with a whole bunch of big ship models and, of course, our famous lighthouse lens, first order lighthouse lens that we find now in the entryway. Well, it stayed like this for a long time because it's hard to move any of these big showcases, but recently, we did something connected with the sea, and it looked on your television screen something like this. That's right. We won the America's Cup. We felt that was enough to celebrate. So we said, hey, we need something from the America's Cup in here. Nothing happened for quite a while. And then we got a phone call. We have something of the America's Cup. Do you want it? We said, yes. What is it? It is the AC-72 catamaran that actually won it. So we said, yeah, we had to clear out that great hull of steam pretty quick and bring the Oracle Racer in 8 parts, 3 hulls, 2 cross beams, bowsprit, 2 foils, let's say. And now we had something that won this cup. This is Tucker Thompson. He is the Oracle spokesperson. He brought it with him. And he said, hey, here's what you guys won. Here's what America won. We're very proud of that. But that's now. How about then? Something completely different. Sometime in the 4th century, Pytheas, he's a mathematician, astronomer. He was a navigator, sailor, and explorer. He was from Greece, went sailing around the islands off the western coast of Europe, Britain, the Orkneys, the Faroes, Shetlands, the islands off Scandinavia. His original narrative of the journey is long gone, but his experience is recounted in the tales told by seafarers more than 3 centuries later. What might he have seen? We know that some 12,000 years ago, long before Pytheas, soon after the last ice age, Scandinavia was people with nomadic tribes or clans, hunter-gatherers, fishermen, farmers. They built no settlements, left few artifacts, but they did leave, carved out on the broad and stately rock faces along Norway's coast, impressive examples of their art. The art of the Arctic Stone Age. Around 5,000 years ago, agriculture was introduced into the North countries, and those nomadic people began to settle. And they started building buildings, let's say. Agriculture was introduced, and they were able to control crops rather than just catch as catch can. They built villages, they built meeting houses. They began to work together as communities and develop a system of worship, pagan worship. Then essentially and eventually, as did all cultures from prehistory and perhaps 60 to 70,000 years ago, the vessels of transport on their rivers and seas began to develop. This allowed the Scandinavians during a peak of dynamic expansion, roughly spanning 3 centuries, to erupt onto the European stage in a virtually irresistible surge of energy. Our exploration today takes us to the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, the British Isles, Africa, the east, the far north. Indeed, as our big blue marble is about 70% water, it was necessary for us to learn the sea since we first emerged as thinking man. And we did, as the earliest fragments and artifacts of civilization will attest. We've been always seafarers, and into our history is inextricably woven the history of our experience with the seas. The pre-Columbian explorers whom we'll meet today are these guys, the Vikings. No, not those guys. People play with my PowerPoints. These Vikings, no, not those Vikings either. Okay, how about the Vikings who were farmers and traders? Today we'll talk about the origins of the people we collectively call the Vikings. We'll learn their culture, their religion, their history, their industry. We'll try to unravel their reasons for going to war, the results of their conquests. We'll attempt to learn their stories and sagas, and even write their alphabet. And finally, the last days of the Vikings and what became of them. All of this within the matrix of their voyages of exploration and exploitation. The stories of those who led the way before our Mr. Cristoforo Colon of Genoa, Christopher Columbus. Then perhaps we can answer the question, are we Vikingen? Are we the Vikings? Okay, let's find some common ground. Well, the Vikings were of Norse ancestry, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, the Scandinavian countries. They traded as early as the 16th century BCE among the British Isles. By the 1st century BCE, trade with Rome had developed. And by about 430, there was an active mercantile business in the market centers of Norway, Hedeby, Gotland, Birka, Koppang, with traders from foreign lands. Of critical necessity to this was, of course, the shipbuilding trade. Mastery of the seas would open new options to these Norse opportunists: trade, plunder, land grabs, power, adventure. They established their own commerce, their culture, their languages, and as they grew, intercommunication. Their roots go back to near prehistory, and as they developed their own culture and character, they would eventually cross vast expanses of uncharted waters, journey through the rivers of Central Europe, move into Byzantium, establish the future Russia. Their experiences varied because of various origins, and their circumstances differed as well. This was a dynamic time, an era of 300 years that transformed Scandinavia and impacted the whole of the known world. They live in a harsh and unforgiving environment. Winters, rest assured, are spent indoors. These early peoples began to build sound dwellings of sod, of staves, of logs, and great halls, communal meeting places where all could gather to learn the news of the day, to enjoy a celebratory feast, to attend the king or chieftain's State of the Union address. These dwellings and halls were somewhat similar throughout the Scandinavian territories, similar because of access to similar building materials, but different because of a lack of communication, a very sparse means of communication. As the populations of these areas grew, they naturally intermingled, and this intercommunication produced a more and more similar language until it became easy to communicate across the whole of Scandinavia in a somewhat common tongue. Well, having established ourselves as a people, and in some cases a unique people, the next step is generally religion and customs. It ties the group together regardless. And these men from North had religion. Their pantheistic pagan customs went back centuries. The various Scandinavian peoples all had their own sets of gods. Might have been curious to us. Back then they were their gods. But typically in Viking lore, there were two families of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. One set protected them and defended them. The other promised fertility, good crops, general welfare, a good harvest, a brilliant granddaughter. Oh, I wonder whose granddaughter that is. These were gifts from the gods. Their trinity comprised Odin, Tor, and Freyr. Odin, the All-Father, was responsible for the creation. He helped fashion earth, sky, and Adam and Eve before embarking on an insatiable quest for knowledge. Adam and Eve in the Norse are Usk and Embla. Consequence. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. Odin's Hall in Asgard is where dead warriors went and spent their afterlife drinking, wenching, fighting until the coming of Ragnarok. Tor, Odin's son, was responsible for us common folk, and Freyr, the son of Njord, had the crops and weather. Everyone loved Freyr. Oh, really, everyone loved Freyr. Not a bad-looking guy. What did they leave us with? Odin, Woden, Wednesday, Tor, Thursday, and Freyr, of course, Friday. There's an interesting element of time in Norse mythology. We all recognize the Valkyries, but who were they or what were they? Odin, the father of man, knew that the end of the world was preordained and that the last days would come in a great cataclysmic battle of a god against God. To prepare himself, Odin would assemble an army of hero warriors. These warriors, the Einherjar, or glorious dead, were chosen and picked from the battlefield by Odin's shield maidens, his female warriors. The fierce Valkyries who rode in the sky over the combat zone, the Valkyries transported the defeated soldiers to Valhalla, to await the battle of Ragnarok against the frost giants, the sea monster Jormungand, and Loki's army from hell, the unworthy dead. Of course, they didn't just wait. They did battle day in and day out. They drank from eternally full horn cups and had their pick of Odin's beautiful handmaidens all night. Each morning, incidentally, their wounds were healed and their cups were filled. Well, the world had been created from a void, Gnungagap, and time would end with Ragnarok. But wait, there's more. After Ragnarok, a new world would arise. Valhalla would end, but the really great warriors would be reclaimed by the Valkyries or by Odin himself and taken to a new Valhalla. Ragnarok, incidentally, has probably happened, and we're waiting for it to happen again. So religion among the various peoples of Scandinavia was rather unusual. Universal, however. They were up to a point devout pagans. Their adversaries were the here we go again. The Vikings and the giants, of course, were the giants. There we are. The monsters, the dwarfs. The center of Odin's universe was the Yggdrasil, the great sacred ash, the world tree, cosmic tree, a mythical tree that connects the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology. In an era where this would be heaven, the idea of a tree is a bit hard for us to assimilate. In the final opera, Götterdämmerung, it is revealed that Wotan, Odin, has had the ash tree chopped down as kindling for Valhalla. Raids on Western Europe early in the 9th century and onward brought many slaves to Scandinavia. And of those, a significant number were Christian. The few Christian missionaries and religious leaders in Denmark and elsewhere in the 9th and 10th century took up the Christian slaves' cause and protected, defended, and comforted them. St. Ansgar was a notable example. Thus, a strong positive Christian influence was brought about as a byproduct of a horribly anti-Christian industry, the very lucrative slave trade. Trade figured in another way. Heathen and pagan traders intent on doing business with Christian merchants had first to, at least nominally, accept Christ. Well, given the fragmented and unorganized inherent nature of paganism and pantheism, the Christian faith was, with its strong center, swayed pretty easily the pagans of Scandinavia. Easily, yes, but not entirely. Christ was acknowledged, but this was not an exclusive acceptance. Christ was merely added to the pantheon, so the average Viking typically sought protection, favors, good fortune, calm seas, health, abundant crops, and fish from whichever of these gods seemed at the time most convenient. Well, eventually, because of the power and influence of their rulers, the countries of Scandinavia would proclaim a national conversion to Christianity. The first of these was Denmark. You have to understand that we're talking about, even in this mid to late 10th century, a very loose amalgamation of communities with no real strong inter-allegiances, nor any deliberate infrastructure, certainly very little evidence of interdependence. So any wholesale cultural, religious, or even economic program was going to be very difficult to bring about. Each small tribe, settlement, or village was ruled by its strongest leader, a chieftain. Well, naturally, some were stronger than others. And the thought was this: if I, a strong chieftain, can accept Christianity and impose it upon a number of village and community groups, then their chieftains will lose power in favor of Christ. And I, as the bringer of the true faith, will emerge as a religious as well as a secular leader. The plan, therefore, was to eliminate competition, and it worked. Norway's King Hakon the Good started Christianity in his realm. He was not totally successful, but he was soon followed by the Olafs, Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson. They finished the job. They accomplished the national conversion by force at sword point, but they were so successful that Olaf Haraldsson, the last of these, was credited with the conversion of Norway, of Orkney, the Faroes, Greenland, and Iceland. He incidentally is St. Olaf. So now you see why so many churches in Scandinavian lands and Minnesota are named St. Olaf's. Well, now we have an idea of the progress of Norse gods, their culture, their religion. Norway has today, incidentally, a national religion. Nationally, they are Lutheran. But how do we stand as explorers? Remember that ships brought the Christian slaves to Scandinavia. Ships brought the priests and religious leaders to Scandinavia in an attempt to convert these pagans. Ships. Well, we've banded together. We have religion, we have principles, we have a culture, and now we need to become less dependent. Industry and commerce, those miracles of independence, left behind artifacts. What did the Norse do for a living? Oh, there were cottage industries, certainly. They were fishermen, they were hunters. They worked in metals and made some mighty nice jewelry. They were accomplished bead makers. What else? Well, In a maritime country, are there not shipyards? We see here the remnants of ships found in Scandinavia. It was the custom to bury important people and kings in their ships or in a ship built for the afterlife. Fortunately for us, the clay into which they were buried preserved them for these 1,000+ years and gave up their secrets as if they had been buried only yesterday. The ships are named for the sites where they were found: Sutton Hoo, Roskilde, Skodelev, Thun, and the most dramatic of all of the ships, the Gokstad and the Oseberg. The Gokstad ship was almost certainly the tomb of a Viking king or chieftain, but the Oseberg ship held a lady, very likely Queen Asa or Osa. The reclamation of these wonderful artifacts gave us important information on the methods of Viking shipbuilding. They are both in a museum in Norway and have been studied by nearly every researcher who covers maritime history or the evolution of the ship. And yes, this includes Mariners Museum's own August Crabtree. These ships were guides for Mr. Crabtree's Mora model. Mora was the flagship of William the Conqueror in 1066. We'll get into that in a moment. Of their talents as shipwrights and sailors, there's no doubt. Indeed, the most important artifacts of the Viking Age are their ships and the grave goods, as they're called, that were buried and interred with the deceased. As we saw earlier, the Norsemen, like all who encountered the seas, developed their primitive craft to move efficiently along their waterways. In the Bronze Age, the Scandinavians moved around their fjords and out into the seas in primitive skin boats. They coasted to other shores and established the first trading links from Kaupang to Hedeby, Hedeby to Berka, linking Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Creating trading allies. Alliances are the formative beginnings of nations. They got to York, and in a special work of art, the Bayeux Tapestry, we see some of what is about to happen because of their migration into the Isles. Well, their vessels evolved like so many others, starting with a log and, of course, a dugout, and then added sides, and finally, decking. Paddles became oars, and steering devices migrated to the useful right-hand side of the craft. Now that side becomes the steerboard, the starboard side of the ship. This arrangement served them well for centuries. So in the 7th century, pretty much up to the 11th, the Varangians, the Swedes or Rus, sailed into the Baltic, established Kiev, Novgorod, and led the foundation for Russia. The Swedes themselves were called Rus in their own language. Eventually, their sea travels took them to the British Isles and, of course, to Greenland, to Labrador, and finally to Vinland, Newfoundland, perhaps even farther south to the great state of Maine. By the time these nomads had settled in the lands they had conquered, they'd established seaways between virtually all of the rivers of Europe, and they had built the foundation for commerce in Europe for ages to come. Remember, these Vikings were from different lands and different cultures. Their ships must then have been different. And how might they have found a location, identified it, and returned without the quadrants, the sextants, the clocks, the backstaffs that would come so much later? They had devices. Here is a bearing dial. Here is a bearing circle. Here is a sun crystal. How did they use these things? We're not really sure, but they did the job. They got them to where they wanted to go, got them back home, got them back to their first location again. When we first found the burial sites of kings and the clear, unmistakable remains of Viking vessels, we supposed them to be very much the same regardless of where we dug. We were wrong. Yes, because of the times, the materials at hand, the purpose, there were many similarities, but they were decidedly not the same. In fact, we now have evidence of several different types of Viking craft, dugouts by the thousands, hide boats similar to the Umiak, and this one is here in our National Maritime Museum. The Knorr, and yes, you pronounce the K. The Knar, maybe the same ship. The Carve, the Fairing, the Drakar, and the infamous Langskip, the long ship, and several smaller vessels found interred alongside the major ship finds. And sizes varied with the purpose and the situation where they were found. Ships were measured in rooms, a room being the space for a rower. In the case of the Gokstad ship, this measurement was about 1 meter. Typically, the ships would be measured at 20 or so rooms, but some were as many as 32, 34, 36 rooms long. 34 pairs of rowers, think of it. King Canute's Phantom ship was said to have been about 80 meters in length, 260 feet long. How many rooms do you suppose this Viking ship has? Enough for a lot of passengers, I'm sure. About 700 AD or perhaps earlier, the sail was hoisted on a sturdy single mast, and the voyages of the Norsemen grew longer. They began to trade more regularly with other lands. They apparently preceded Columbus into North America by about half a millennium. They also realized an advantage in an alternative mode of collecting wealth and land. Collecting wealth and land. Think about that for a moment. This sail offered the ability to land their shallow draft vessels on pretty much any beach, step off into shallow water, advance to the nearest source of whatever they needed or wanted, sack, loot, pillage, rape, and get out of there quickly. Worked nearly every time. The long ship loosed the Norse on the world and launched what we now call the Viking Era. So how do we see the Viking Era? Let's talk about one of the main features that has held sway for many, many years: war and conquest. Now, hvis du er norsk, you may opt out of this exercise. All others, clear your throat, assume your deepest monotone, and read with me. From the fury of the Norsemen, O Lord, protect us. So prayed the English in the 10th century. On a bright day in 793, a monk at the monastery of Lindisfarne, an island in the northeast coast of England, was walking out to draw water from the well when he saw ships approaching from the east. He quickly went back into the hall and called to several brothers, "Come, we have visitors, traders perhaps." What followed was not at all what he expected. The raid, massacre on Lindisfarne's innocent monks marked the dawn of what we now call the Viking Age. A bloody one-sided assault whose purpose was entirely unwarranted, either to gain the wealth of the monastery's property or to terrorize the Christians, that fast-growing cult which opposed and threatened the traditional Norse gods' power. An assault which forever branded the Vikings as bloodthirsty invaders without conscience, compassion, or even reason. For these innocent monks, this was surely their September 11th. An unthinkable evil had come to their fortress of peace and sanctitude. So now the question becomes more complex. Who were these Vikings? We saw them as farmers, as fishers, hunters, traders, explorers, mariners, shipbuilders, intelligent citizens of orderly communities who governed themselves well. So now they're suddenly bloodthirsty barbarians? Let's clear up some misconceptions. These attacks we know of were diverse and they were scattered. We see them as swarms of warriors raiding, invading all over the map. Not so. They typically raided in small groups at odd intervals, mostly in the summer months. Very, very few Europeans in the Viking Age even saw a Viking raid. The raiding parties were led by local chieftains. This was not a national navy that would form up an attack en masse. The leader might have a few boats and maybe 100 or so followers. They couldn't carry food. They hadn't invented the refrigerator yet. Not much extra space either. So they found settlements, cleared out the inhabitants, and took what they needed or wanted. They sacked, they looted, they pillaged, and they raped, and they left. Of course, a lot of the wealth of the age was found within the church. So monasteries were a likely target. But didn't they kill people? Yes, in many cases. They may be considered ruthless, but they lived in a ruthless age. All over Europe, thrones were challenged. The head guy was killed. There was a revolt, a junta. The Vikings were not so different. They were not Christians, so they had little compunction about killing women and children and churchmen, the priests and the elders. But they also had need of workers, of slaves. So they almost certainly kept the able-bodied. And those people eventually assimilated into Viking culture. So we might not see all blonde, blue-eyed, strong men in a Viking settlement. There would be Italians, Portuguese, French, Russians. Oh, and by the way, they did not call themselves Vikings, just as the Phoenicians were not called Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were the people from Tyre, from Sidon, from Byblos. So the Vikings had their origins in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, then Iceland and Finland. During the Viking Age, Scandinavia was not Denmark, Norway, Sweden, but small areas ruled over by a chieftain. So they were not a Viking nation, not at all unified at this point in their history. And not all Scandinavians would have fit our definition of Viking. Viking, incidentally, doesn't even refer to a location or a person, but to a sea voyage. To fare a Viking meant to go on a sea voyage, albeit typical reference was to a raid. In Old Norse, the sailor, the seaman, the raider, was called Vikinger. Just add a little R to the end of Viking. In fact, more accurately, Wikinger. Well, every culture must have its stories, its literature. So the Viking sagas are the heroic poems and prose of the Norsemen. Particularly today, the sagas of Snorri Sterlison. Snorri was an Icelander who lived some few years after the Viking Age, about a century and a half after, to be more accurate. He died in 1241, but he recorded the stories he had heard of the Viking kings, of their exploits, and needless to say, of their legends. This is largely myth, but in fantasy, we often find truth. Many of the sagas can be corroborated with archaeological evidence, particularly the stories of voyages and vessels, but pretty much all of the stories and sagas were written a century or more after the demise of the Viking culture. At its peak of activity, the Norse cultures were just developing a written form of communication, and their stories were more fable than fact, if indeed they were at all intended to relate a true event. The sagas were written in Iceland, but they cover a broad slice of geography and of time. Snorri starts indeed in prehistoric times with myths and gods and continues well up into the 12th century. And as he visited other Scandinavian lands, he writes of Norway, of Greenland, of Vinland, the explorers during those earlier years. A more or less common northern version of the Germanic language was spoken across Scandinavia. So as a result, stories could spread and, of course, enlarge. Also, speaking and understanding a common tongue, different groups could cooperate, whether it be for trade, for pillage, for conquest, but the landscape and environment in these widespread countries varied so greatly that the inhabitants had many differences of daily life, differences of experience. Political allegiances varied greatly, so the stories would almost certainly be modified in some fashion as they passed from storyteller to storyteller. Consider the typical evolution of a language. Harold tells Olaf his story of filling 3 large nets with fish so that he will prosper and be well fed for quite a while. He dries most of the fish and sells some to buy a larger net. Olaf, who idolizes Harold and wants to be just like him when he grows up, tells of Harold's great day on the water to Sigurd, but now it's 10 large nets he filled, and he sells half the fish. He buys a new boat. Now, Harold Eriksson, Eric, of course, was his dad, is known throughout his community as Harold the Lucky, or perhaps Harold the Fish Gatherer. Well, that's good for Harold, not so good for the historians. The story's been bent a little. Suppose Harold had told his tale to Sven, who thought Harold an insufferable bore. What then? The 3 large nets become 1 small net, just enough to feed his family a short while, and Harold has to sell his boat to buy fish from the fishmonger. What would solve this problem? Doesn't take long to think about that. So as the Scandinavians were not totally illiterate in the first millennium, Snorri recorded what had been oral history and legend. To do so, he needed a written language. Fortunately, by this time, there was one. In fact, there were several, and they were collectively called runes. If we could date an origin for this written code, we would place its beginnings around 250 to 150 BCE. It probably originated in Denmark and spread throughout the Norse countries, and it most likely originated with the Etruscan language. It can be defined as an alphabet so that we understand what it is, but that's inaccurate, isn't it? Of the several such that have been found, the oldest is known as the Elder Futhark. The Elder Futhark. It serves as the basis for all runes. Why is it called Futhark? Why is our alphabet called alphabet? Take a look. The order of letters, F, U, T, H, A, R, K. Futhark. We have a futhark, and we're going to do a little demonstration right now and show you how this thing works. And whether it will work for you depends. You're going to hold it? Do you want me to hold it? Doesn't matter. Here we are. I'm going to move over a little bit. What do you think this says? If you read through your futhark, you can make out the pronunciation for the various runes we see here. They spell in our alphabet R-O-N-I. Phonetically, that's my Christian name, Roni. It's also my Welsh name. Now, let's look at the other part here. What does this spell? If you tried to read it the same way, it looks like Nusmajlig. That's not my other name. Why? Because here, it starts here, and it reads the wrong way to spell the grandson of Gilliamson. What happened? Thank you. That was Vanna holding the... What happened? Well, there was no linear consideration. I wrote my name so you could read it easily, but my Welsh surname, nope. Written instead of left to right, right to left. Sometimes runes were written that way. and sometimes right to left, sometimes top to bottom. Sometimes they were actually encoded. Sometimes they were written in a spiral. Fortunately for the researchers and historians, stele and other runestones have been found all over the place, from the Balkans to the Baltic, from Iceland to Minnesota, maybe even some in Maine. How do they arrive at such far-flung sites? They didn't float. Ships. When you're answering a question, if you use the word ships, you're going to be right most of the time. Runes are found on rocks, on sword blades and hilts, on jewelry, even on furniture, pretty much everywhere. Now let's go back to the shore where Harold is sharing his tale of prowess as a fisherman. And simultaneously, his scribe is transferring the fish story to a stone in this runic style. Harold's story is carved in stone and will now endure without being expanded upon nor diminished. We might, in fact, dig it up centuries later. After all, we need parking lots. We need shopping centers. Harold, of course, was not atypical. Many of the Norse were fishermen. Some were hunters, farmers. They had their families, their responsibilities, spent much of their days and months attending to these things, these personal obligations. They were, as a rule, thrifty and inventive. They were cooperative in their communities and traded where they could. And interestingly, as they moved about and settled in various foreign lands, they tended to assimilate themselves into the culture of their new digs. Even the great and legendary King Canute came to see himself as the King of England. Well, so it was that Rolf the Ganger, as he was given rule over a certain portion of France, the Norsemen's land, became, for all appearances, French. King Charles the Simple, as a concession to appease the Norsemen, and as many other rulers had done before him, granted the title of Duke of lands in the southern area of the Seine to Rollo, and he ruled in that area from 911 until he died in 927. One of his descendants was a duke named William. By William's time, the area had been clearly defined and was now called Normandy. Now, here's an interesting dilemma. England's King Edward the Confessor, having no legitimate heirs, had at one time promised his throne to Duke William, probably to avoid any harm coming to him or his people from William, a bastard. The King of Norway, however, in agreement with King Harthacnut, the last Danish king of England, had declared that if neither king left a bona fide successor, the throne would pass to King Harald Sigurdsson. Well, the plot thickened as immediately upon Edward's death, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful man in England at the time, got himself crowned King of England. Muy pronto, as they say in Norse. Certainly neither William nor Harald Sigurdsson would stand for this outrage. Both rulers started laying their plans. Harold's tactic, Harald Sigurdsson, also called Harald Hardrada, which means Harold the bad guy, pretty much, buoyed and supported by King Harold Godwinson's turncoat brother, Earl Tostig, was to assemble an army of about 4,500, sail across the North Sea, up the river to Rickhall, about 16 miles downriver from York or Jorvik, and march down to England, sack, loot, pillage, rape, and as soon as he found him, chop King Harold Godwinson's head off. He found King Harold sooner than he expected at Stamford Bridge with a couple of friends. And although many English were killed, King Harold Godwinson prevailed. Here's how bad it was. Harold Sigurdsson, Harold Hardrada, took about 300 ships over to raid England. It only took 24 to ferry the survivors back to Denmark. One down, it ain't over. William had assembled about 650 ships at Valkyries sur Somme on the Normandy coast. His intent was to sail across the channel. He dared not take the channel for fear of being seen. Land his men and horses and do battle to the death. As luck would have it, William was detained by unfavorable weather and could not sail until September 28th. Harold had just been defeated, Harold Sigurdsson, in fact, slain 2 days earlier. Harold Godwinson marched his weary surviving army south to Hastings as William's forces were making a landing around Pevensey Beach. We know how this story ends, don't we? It's getting complicated. Hope you're taking notes. There will be a test. It ends on October 14th, 1066. Each army numbered 6,000 or 7,000, but William's men were fresh. Harold's were tired, some wounded. Much of William's army was on horseback. Harold's men were on foot. In Harold's favor was the fact that William's cavalry had to march up a hill at Hastings, and this is clearly a disadvantage for a mounted army. But William's army fought well. At one point, they were nearly defeated. William rallied them, and they attacked with a newfound vigor. Harold was defeated and slain at Hastings. And on Christmas Day in the year of our Lord 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, was crowned King of England. See, the real question of rule was not who deserved the throne, not who was promised the crown, but who was tough enough to take it and keep it. What brought this about? Ships. The answer wins again. William was an enlightened and fair ruler and brought stability, order, brought laws to England. He was also careful to consolidate his power and to maintain a navy of ships. Much of what the British Empire became is due to William's crossing the 56 miles of English Channel in September 1066, and ships. Now, if we wish to talk diaspora, what areas do we look into? We've traveled the known world in the last, not quite an hour. Started with the explorations of Eric the Red, followed closely by his son, Leif Erikson, whom we said a little about because, well, you already know about him, don't you? Then we finished up in the Western Europe and the British Isles. The Vikings certainly did not just die out. A new culture came to Western Europe. Raiding and looting, yesterday's news, became passé, and the generations of those who came after Harold, Canute, Rollo, Sigurd, Olaf, and William have been fruitful and multiplied and filled the earth with Vikings. Remember this guy? His name is Dag Hammarskjöld. And he was Secretary of the UN, Secretary General of the UN in 1956 and through 1961. Here's someone who more than anyone had remained a Viking till his death in 2002. His name is Tor Heyerdahl. And that's him. Here's another guy who is pretty important and may seem to become more important as time goes on. This guy had to do with atomic structure and the quantum theory. How many remember his name? It's Niels Bohr. He was Danish. There are numerous challenges in finding the truth about the age of the Vikings. Can we answer the question now? Is it us? But not the least challenge is our bias toward the written world, historical accounts. We must bear in mind that these stories were, for the most part, written by those who felt the least kindness toward whatever the truth of Viking history might be. Some survived. They were not written contemporaneously, so they are, to a degree, naturally biased. Relatively recently, 20 or 30 years ago, artifacts began to give us a clearer picture of the Viking Age, and we're finding it vastly different from what we had imagined. So as pivotal as was the year 1066, Harold Hardrada's defeat at Stamford Bridge, William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings, this was not Ragnarok, not the end of the Viking world. It would come soon enough. We'll reflect back over the nearly 3 centuries before 1066. Scandinavia, a loosely defined geographical area, have been drawn into a new existence, into a new cultural sphere, that of the European Christian community. And now we write the last chapter in the Viking saga. In a relatively short span of time, a curtain had come down, a curtain on an age that demonized the Norsemen, terrorized the Western Europeans, thereby isolating the Vikings from a burgeoning global culture. Behind that curtain, a most dramatic and pivotal set change was unfolding. As the curtain parts at the end of the 11th century, the new world was revealed, a world of Christian nation states where pagan tribes had ruled, a world of commerce and traders where raiders and invaders had ruled, a world of central authority where virtual anarchy and chaos had been the order of the day. And what was the chief engine of this change? The ship. As always was the case, we move over our liquid planet now in another strata, the skies. But firmly encased in our very DNA is that indelible elemental jewel, the glory of the ships and the romance of the seas. There's not really a test. I was just kidding, but I will welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that amazing presentation. I do have one question in the Q&A box from Elise. I just read that in the Spanish accounts, they encountered a dozen or so women warriors fierce in battle and leading the men in the Amazon. The women were pale-skinned with long, blonde, braided hair. The battle was near the coast and river. Sounded like Viking women to me. Any thoughts? And what happened to the Viking men?
Good question. It's new information. Many of the accounts show the Viking women as being very submissive at the time and not being a real strong part of it. New information arriving to us now shows that that wasn't the case at all. The majority of Viking women took care of their families and their household chores, and so did the men. But the women who went to battle were few and far between. Now we're finding more and more that the women did, in fact, rule with a strong fist from time to time, and some became, if not official, at least de facto rulers of their own clans and tribes. Can't give you anything definitive yet. It's going to take a lot more study, but I believe we're on the right track. And I believe your assumption that, yeah, Viking women were stronger than maybe we thought they were and did, in fact, move around and go into other areas, still showing their strength, might be a very accurate assumption.
Okay. And then another question from Jeremy. Did Tor Heyerdahl ever visit the museum?
Ever visit?
I guess, did he ever visit our museum or another museum? I think our museum. Jeremy, if you want to clarify that question, that might be helpful.
Well, let's talk about Tor Heyerdahl first. His intent was to show that the Vikings could have, in very rude boats, balsa rafts, kontiki, etc., could have made this voyage without modern instruments or mercury outboard motors. He proved that it certainly could be done, and he remained faithful to his Viking history, his Norse history, until the day he died. He believed it, and he proved it, in fact. Now, I don't know where your landing point was. I didn't get that.
Question from William. I've read that after Vikings settled trading posts as far south as the Ukraine, Local tribes wanting to stop fighting each other asked the Vikings to name men to be local kings to enforce peace. One such settlement was Kiev.
Yes.
Okay.
Kiev was one of the key settlements in the Vikings merging into, I won't say taking over, merging into the area that became Russia. And of course, Kiev is now the capital of the Ukraine.
Okay.
And the source of chicken Kiev.
Oh, okay. Now that I've heard of, yeah, absolutely. All right, and yeah, so that question was, did Mr. Heyerdahl ever visit the Mariners Museum?
Oh, no, I don't believe so. Gosh, that's a good question. It's something I'm going to have to look up. I don't find anything in our records that shows that he did, in fact, come here. We had some really neat Polynesians here fairly recently. I don't believe Tor Heyerdahl came here. It's a good question, and I'll certainly look it up.
Okay.
Find out.
Another question. If one is of Scandinavian ancestry, does that make one a Viking?
I didn't.
Can you repeat that question, Sherry?
Sure. If one is of Scandinavian ancestry, does that make one a Viking?
If it were me, I'd say yes, but no, factually, no. When I say, are we the Vikings, we're looking at a history that spanned about 3 centuries. Now, I would say that anyone born in Scandinavia after 1066 would be Norse or Swedish or Icelandic or that. I don't think you could legitimately call yourself a Wikinger or Viking, but I would.
Okay. And then Joanne asked that we show the map again of North America and how far south the Vikings went.
Gosh, when you look at North America, we're looking primarily at Vinland and up around Newfoundland in that area. However, authenticated artifacts from the Viking Age have been found as far south as Maine. Doesn't mean they were there. They could have gotten there by other means, and there's no definitive proof that anything was established in Maine.
Okay.
But you see Markland and Vinland here in Labrador.
Okay.
And the little ME at the bottom, well, that's Maine.
Okay.
So we're not saying they got there, but it's a hop, skip, and a jump.
Absolutely. Okay, Brian asks, did Vikings understand need for flexibility with long ship clinker / plank construction more than any other cultures at the time? Why was this boat type not adopted by others?
It was adopted by others. And in fact, a lot of the rowboats you buy today are the clinker construction or lap strake construction. The Egyptian boats from back in the 1500 BCE were lap strake construction. They didn't necessarily call it that. Into Rome in the 1st century lap strake, they used a process that was very similar to what Vikings used. And sometimes the strakes or the boards were actually sewn together with or animal hide sewn together. And I think he mentioned something about the clincher construction where the boards would overlap very slightly in the construction of a lap strake ship. A nail will be driven through both, a clincher nail, a rove or a tight washer would be put over it inside the boat, and then it will be hammered or clinched down into the wood. That construction was very popular in the North and on the Mediterranean. The other form of construction, carvel, which had the boards edge to edge, became popular later on. Larger, longer ships could be made from it. Now, some who employed the lap strake method for long boats, Viking longboats, would have had a sort of a hog truss near the bottom of the boat that the Egyptians had it, but Yeah, it was a very handy boat for them. And once they added a sail, which as you know was later on, they became long-term boats. They slept in their boats from time to time. They had sleeping bags made of skin with the fur on the inside. Sometimes they would coast, and I mentioned that term, go along the coast and stop at every either bad weather or nightfall, bring the boat ashore, turn it slightly on its side and have some shelter. Yeah, it was a very useful boat for them in a number of different sizes and scales.
Thank you. Claude asks, did the Newfoundland dogs called bear dogs by the Vikings accompany the Vikings in battle, and did the Vikings take them to Newfoundland?
Your sound is kind of fuzzy, and I didn't get the whole.
Okay, I'll ask. Did the Newfoundland dogs called bear dogs by the Vikings accompany the Vikings in battle, and did the Vikings take them to Newfoundland?
I'd have to say I don't know. I'm not familiar with that whole line of the question. No, I don't know. I'm not aware that they took any other than themselves, and then who were the Viking Era, who were the raiders. But I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Okay, that's fair. All right. Anonymous attendee asks, didn't the Vikings have female warriors named shield maidens?
Shield maidens.
Shield.
Yes.
Shield maidens.
I'm not sure the Vikings did, but the shield maiden was the other name for the Valkyries, for the mythical shield maidens who flew over the battle zones and carried the honorable dead to Valhalla.
Okay. Casey Lewis says, first, just want to say hi to my Uncle Ron.
Hey, Casey, hope you're well.
And her question is, do we know the size of the longest longship?
Probably Canute's longship, and I don't recall the exact size of it yet. But if that's Casey's question, I can certainly answer her in the very near future.
Okay. And then William noted in the chat, speaking of boat design, I've read that Viking settlements in Greenland gave way to local Inuit type cultures because their lapstrake boats didn't go fast enough to catch seals while the native kayaks could.
It sounds like you're saying the culture in the northeast preferred the skin boats or the umiaks and kayaks to the kayaks, and all of the skin boats were exceedingly limited for the most part in the number of passengers they could carry because they were skins, they were animal skins, walrus predominantly. I'm not aware that change would have occurred, that change did occur, and I can't see a great deal of rationale for it occurring.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, are there any other questions at this time? I do not see any. I do not see any raised hands. So at this time, I will say thank you so much for joining us. Ron, excellent presentation as always. And
Thank you.
we invite you to come into our galleries. We're open and ready to welcome you back. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Stay well.